On the morning of November 29, 1970, the thin veil of fog clung low over the icy slopes of Isdal Valley, a remote gorge near Bergen, Norway. The silence was broken only by the crunch of footsteps, a father and his two daughters hikers, cutting through the cold wilderness. They had no idea what awaited them beyond the rocks. Hidden in a hollow where the frost had yet to claim the ground, lay the remains of a woman. Her body was grotesquely burned, twisted, as if fire had consumed her from within. Around her were scattered strange artifacts, fragments of clothing, melted plastic bottles, a broken umbrella, and an acrid smell that clung to the air like a warning. Nearby police would later recover prescription pills, a bottle of liquor, and what looked like traces of a ritual fire. There was no handbag, no wallet, no passport, no identity. When investigators arrived, they noted the strangeness at once. The woman had not simply died, she had been erased. Her fingerprints were scorched, her belongings stripped of labels, her life reduced to ash in the snow. That night, Bergen police opened a file under a temporary name, the Isdal Woman. It was a case that would spiral into one of the greatest mysteries of the Cold War, where every clue pulled them further into the shadow games of espionage, deception, and the eternal question, who was she? The valley lay in silence, a place the locals nicknamed Death Valley, long before the incident. The steep slopes and sudden weather changes had claimed more than a few lives over the years, hikers lost in the fog, climbers swallowed by the stone walls of Isdalen. It was a place with its own reputation for tragedy, a reminder that the mountains did not forgive carelessness. But what was discovered on that cold Sunday morning in 1970 was unlike any accident. The father and his daughters had been hiking to escape the monotony of the city. They followed a trail weaving between frost-coated pines, when the youngest girl pointed to something out of place. It wasn't just the faint smell in the air, bitter and chemical. It was the way the birds had gone silent. They stepped closer. At first, the father thought it might be the remains of a campfire, but the shape revealed itself quickly, too human, too horrifying. The body was lying flat on a bed of rock and moss, her legs stretched, arms bent in unnatural angles. Her front was almost entirely burned, the skin blistered and blackened while her back was untouched, pale against the ground. The fire had been selective, deliberate. Around her lay personal belongings scattered with eerie precision, a few partially melted bottles, a broken umbrella, fragments of clothing, with the tags carefully cut away. Close by, investigators would later find 12 pink sleeping pills, some partially dissolved, others intact. The father, shaken, hurried his daughters away before reporting to the authorities. Within hours, Bergen police descended on the site. Officers quickly realized this wasn't just an accidental fire or a suicide in the wilderness. Something about the scene was staged. Detectives noted her jewelry, a watch, and 2 earrings had been placed neatly beside her body. Not worn, not broken, removed intentionally. Close to the corpse, they found traces of gasoline. Her lungs contained smoke, suggesting she was alive when the fire started. She had not died elsewhere and been placed here afterward. No, she had burned here in this isolated clearing. The official autopsy later revealed more disturbing facts. She had consumed a large dose of sleeping pills washed down with alcohol. Her stomach was filled with tablets, though not enough to kill instantly. Her death was labeled a combination of carbon monoxide poisoning burns and barbiturate intoxication, a cocktail of suffering. Yet, as investigators pieced the fragments together, the mystery only deepened. No one reported a missing woman fitting her description in Bergen. She carried no identification. Even her clothing had its labels removed, cut away meticulously with scissors. The shoes bore no manufacturer's marks. It was as if every trace of her identity had been stripped clean before she entered the valley. Police broadened their search. Days later, they located 2 suitcases at the Bergen railway station. Inside were her belongings, wigs, cosmetics, prescription bottles with the labels scraped off, and clothing, all tags removed. Among the items, investigators noticed coded notes scribbled in a small notebook. The codes were cryptic strings of letters and numbers that at first appeared meaningless. But after careful study, they realized the writing referred to dates and locations, cities across Europe she had traveled to in the months before her death, who carried multiple wigs, stripped their clothing of labels, and traveled across Europe using coded itineraries. To investigators, one explanation whispered itself almost too loudly: espionage. The Cold War had cast its shadow across the continent. Norway, perched on the northern edge of Europe, was a strategic prize. NATO bases dotted its coastlines. Soviet submarines lurked just beyond the fjords. Bergen itself was home to a critical naval installation. If a spy had been operating here, it was not difficult to imagine her meeting a violent end. Witnesses soon emerged. Hotel staff across Norway recalled a mysterious woman who fit the description. She had checked into multiple hotels under various names: Fenella Lorsch, Claudia Nielsen, Vera Schloss. Always with false addresses. Always alone. She spoke several languages fluently: French, German, Flemish, even some English, but carried an accent no one could place. She ordered meals with sophistication, dressed elegantly, and yet she seemed perpetually on edge, as if scanning the room for unseen threats. One waiter remembered her peculiar request: a meal without garlic. Another recalled her dining alone, scribbling in her notebook, her eyes darting to the door each time it opened. She travelled frequently between Oslo, Stavanger, Bergen, and even beyond to Paris and Hamburg. The police, sensing the enormity of the case, attempted to trace her movements. Immigration records showed no such woman entering Norway under her many aliases. Interpol was contacted, but no country admitted to knowing her. She seemed to exist only in fragments, a shadow drifting from hotel room to hotel room. When they attempted to lift her fingerprints, they were shocked. They matched no records in any criminal or civilian database. A woman without a past, without a family, without a home, but not without enemies. One witness, a Bergen shopkeeper, claimed he had seen her days before her death. She was with two men dressed in dark coats, walking briskly toward the city centre. Another traveller reported seeing her on the train arguing quietly with someone in a foreign language. In the days leading up to her death, her movements became increasingly frantic, her demeanour strained as though she knew the end was coming. Detectives debated endlessly. Was she a spy caught in a deadly game? A criminal courier silenced before revealing too much, or simply a tragic woman hiding from her past? The press swarmed the story, dubbing her the Isdal Woman. Photographs of her reconstructed face appeared on front pages across Europe. Speculation raged. Some believed she was Israeli intelligence, others thought Soviet. The more sensational theories painted her as part of an underground arms trade, or a courtesan entangled with powerful men. Yet through it all, the facts remained chillingly simple. A woman meticulously erased, found dead in a valley already cursed with death. Her final moments marked not by peace, but by fire. And behind the whispers of espionage, there lingered an unsettling possibility. Perhaps she was neither spy nor criminal. Perhaps she was something else entirely. Investigators staring into the hollow sockets of the case were left with only one conclusion: they had entered a labyrinth where every clue pointed not to answers, but to deeper layers of silence. The Isdal Woman was no ordinary victim. She was a cipher, a question carved in flesh and flame. The autopsy room smelled faintly of antiseptic and burnt flesh. Under the dim lights, the forensic team worked with methodical precision, pulling apart the remnants of the woman's story piece by piece. The report read: clinically stripped of drama, female, estimated age between 25 and 40, height 164 centimeters, well-nourished, European descent. But each sterile line carried the weight of mystery. Her dental work drew particular attention. Several teeth had been filled with unusual materials, some common in Western Europe, others more typical of Eastern Bloc practices. It was as if her mouth alone had crossed borders. Norwegian police forwarded these details to Interpol, hoping someone somewhere would recognize the pattern. No answer came. The absence of identification was deliberate. Even her fingerprints had been manipulated, partially sanded, the ridges faint in places, as though she had attempted to erase herself. Still, a few impressions were preserved, and these too were sent across Europe. Once again, nothing. She was a ghost in every system. Attention turned to the 2 suitcases found at Bergen railway station. Within them lay a puzzle. Clothing neatly folded, but with every single label removed. Prescription bottles, their surfaces scraped clean of any pharmacy name. Makeup containers, foreign but untraceable. Wigs, black, blonde and auburn, each styled differently. A single notepad filled with enigmatic codes. The codes proved less impenetrable than expected. Investigators deduced they were a personal system for logging her travels, flight numbers, train routes, hotel stays. The pattern revealed a restless path: Oslo, Trondheim, Stavanger, Bergen, Hamburg, Paris. The journey of a woman moving with purpose, yet careful, never to leave a trace. And then there was the odor of phenol and garlic lingering on her clothing. Some experts suggested it could be from industrial substances. Others thought it a sign of someone working in chemical environments. It was yet another fragment, another thread, leading nowhere. Witnesses trickled in as the case dominated headlines. Hotel clerks remembered her face. She had checked into lodgings across Norway under at least 9 false names. She spoke multiple languages, German most fluently, though not perfectly. Sometimes she claimed to be Belgian, other times French. She always requested rooms facing away from the street. She paid in cash. One clerk recalled her dressing elegantly in public but wearing plain clothes indoors, as though saving appearances for when it mattered. Another remembered her ordering a meal with wine, only to leave half of it untouched, staring silently at her plate for long minutes. The descriptions painted a portrait, not of a tourist, but of a woman on edge, moving constantly, concealing herself, wary of every stranger. Norwegian police could not ignore the obvious. This was 1970. The Cold War raged across every corner of Europe. Norway's proximity to the Soviet Union and its NATO bases made it a frontline state in the silent conflict. Espionage was not an abstract threat, it was a constant presence. Could the Isdal Woman have been a courier ferrying secrets between handlers? Could she have been a double agent, unmasked and eliminated? The evidence whispered espionage, but it never spoke clearly. Even more chilling were the final witnesses. Several people reported seeing her days before her death, walking alone through Bergen, her expression tense. One man claimed she had been followed. Another believed she was meeting with unidentified individuals in dark coats. Their conversation urgent, heated. When police tried to trace her aliases through hotels, they found she had always checked in with a false passport. None of the names matched real citizens. Her life was an endless masquerade, each mask discarded when it became inconvenient. And then silence. By the time her body was found, the Isdal Woman had already vanished from the world of the living. What remained was a puzzle, a burned corpse, a suitcase full of disguises and questions that seemed too large for the quiet valleys of Norway. The investigators pressed on, aware that each step into the labyrinth only left them more disoriented. Every new clue threatened to collapse under its own weight, every theory dissolving into speculation. Yet there was one certainty: someone somewhere had wanted her dead. And someone somewhere knew exactly who she was. The international inquiry began quietly, almost in whispers. Norwegian authorities, uncertain whether they were dealing with a simple tragedy or a geopolitical incident, sent discreet requests through diplomatic channels. Interpol received the case details, though no one expected much. The woman's false passports, her altered fingerprints, her multiple wigs, they suggested a life designed never to intersect with ordinary databases. Still, the investigation rippled outward. Embassies were quietly asked, had any citizen gone missing? Did anyone match the description? Slim, European features, dark hair, early 30s. The replies came back with bureaucratic certainty. No, no, no. but the silence felt too complete, too rehearsed. Then came the first unsettling connection. Analysts reviewing her coded notepad realized one of her trips coincided with the secret testing of advanced weaponry off the Norwegian coast. Military submarines, NATO exercises experimental systems. The woman had been in Stavanger at the precise moment Allied forces were running drills invisible to the public. Coincidence? Investigators and detectives are still debating whether she had been merely a traveler or an observer with a classified mission. The suitcases yielded more fragments. Inside one shoe, a trace of paraffin. Inside a plastic bag, a tiny spoon with burnt residue. Some speculated it suggested drug use. Others argued it pointed to signal fires or improvised chemistry. As with everything else in the case, no conclusion held for long. Still, some items felt deliberate in their mystery. Among the cosmetics, there was a fingerprint believed to be hers, but faint, almost smudged into obscurity. On one of the wigs, a hair not matching her DNA was found belonging perhaps to someone else entirely. Was it a lover, an accomplice, or a pursuer who had handled it? The forensic team could not say. The trail of hotel stays began to reveal another truth. She had not been alone. Several clerks remembered her meeting men, always different, always brief encounters. Some were described as tall, German-speaking. Others seemed Mediterranean. None left behind names, receipts, or records. She moved through them like a phantom, and they through her. Norwegian intelligence began to whisper the unthinkable. Was this not just a single woman, but part of a network, a web of agents stretched across Europe using ordinary cities as staging grounds for invisible battles? If so, her death in Isdalen was not random. It was a message or a cover-up. And yet there was the other possibility. Perhaps she had been a criminal, trafficking in stolen goods or black market materials, her disguises the tools of a con artist rather than a spy. In the chaos of Cold War paranoia, the line between espionage and organized crime blurred easily. Journalists seized upon the mystery, publishing speculative headlines. Some papers suggested she was a spy caught in the deadly crosscurrents of East and West. Others claimed she had been part of a clandestine romance, killed when her double life unraveled. The public, fascinated and disturbed, gave her a name, Isdalskvinnen, the Isdal Woman. Meanwhile, investigators in Bergen pieced together her last days. She had checked out of Hotel Hordeheimen under the alias Fenella Lorch, paying in cash. A bellboy recalled she seemed anxious, avoiding eye contact. Her suitcase was heavy. Later that day, she was seen boarding a train, then wandering in the city wearing a long coat, despite the mild weather. The contradictions only multiplied. Witnesses described her as both aloof and charming, both elegant and weary. She carried herself with purpose, but her eyes betrayed a fatigue, as if she knew the end was near. And then, the forest. On the final day of her life, she was reportedly spotted hiking into Isdalen Valley. Some say she was with 2 men. Others recall seeing her alone, her stride unsteady. A professor claimed she appeared in a trance. None of these accounts could be proven, but together they formed a mosaic of dread. Within days, her body was found among the rocks, scorched by flames, the smell of burnt flesh clinging to the valley air. Matches, petrol, sleeping pills. Suicide, or a staged death. Even here, nothing aligned. The number of pills in her system suggested she could not have walked into the valley unaided. Yet the burns suggested deliberate immolation. Investigators wavered between theories. Had she taken her own life in despair, or had others ensured she could never speak again? The Cold War cast its long shadow across every possibility. A spy silenced by her handlers, a courier caught by enemies, or merely a woman crushed under secrets too heavy to bear. The Isdal woman remained silent, her charred lips unable to reveal anything more. But her mystery was only beginning. Espionage. The word lingered in the air like smoke. It wasn't spoken loudly in the police headquarters of Bergen, but it didn't have to be. Everyone could feel it. The suits from Oslo and the whispers from NATO officers hinted at a deeper current running beneath the woman's scorched body. In the winter of 1970, Norway was no backwater. It was a vital NATO outpost, perched at the edge of the Arctic, its fjords hiding submarine lanes, its coastlines shadowed by Russian eyes. The Cold War wasn't an abstract contest. It was visible in radar stations, in coded transmissions, in men who smiled politely at each other while taking mental photographs. The Isdal Woman's travel patterns began to look less like tourism and more like reconnaissance. She had visited ports, harbours and cities aligned with strategic significance. Stavanger, Trondheim, Bergen, all within reach of NATO's most secret movements. Her notepad, decoded by patient analysts, contained what appeared to be shorthand references to dates and military activity. Coincidence? Investigators and detectives are still debating whether her cryptic scribbles marked ordinary journeys, or if they logged the movements of nuclear vessels sliding quietly into Norwegian waters. Her disguises spoke louder still. Multiple wigs, each styled differently, each tailored for a different persona. Conservative for a businesswoman, glamorous for a traveler, plain for someone blending into crowds. It wasn't the toolkit of an amateur. It was the wardrobe of someone whose very existence depended on vanishing in plain sight. There were signs she had trained for this. Witnesses recalled she spoke several languages, shifting between German, French, and English with ease. At one hotel, she signed her name differently each time, yet with the controlled flourish of someone accustomed to creating identities. The intelligence services leaned in closer. Norway's counterintelligence agency began cross-referencing her aliases with known spy networks. Fenella Lorsch, Claudia Tilt, Vera Schlosseneck. Each identity hovered between plausible and fabricated, never leaving a traceable family, employer, or past. But here lay the paradox. If she was a spy, why had she been so careless? Why leave wigs and notepads behind? Why draw attention with her constant hotel changes and conspicuous behavior? Was it deliberate, an intentional breadcrumb trail? Or had something gone terribly wrong in her final days? There was also the matter of her shoes. Investigators noticed her feet were oddly small compared to the footwear she owned. Some believed the shoes weren't hers at all, that she had borrowed them, or that someone had planted them. Others whispered darker theories. Perhaps they had belonged to another operative, one who never walked out of Isdal Valley. The burned remains of her clothing told another story. The zippers had been carefully removed, the labels cut out, as if someone wanted her to vanish even in death. That level of precision felt less like suicide, more like an execution. Still, the official police line wavered. Suicide remained on the record, if only because no evidence firmly contradicted it. She had access to sleeping pills, she had accelerants, and she had walked into the valley of her own accord, supposedly. But even among the investigators there was doubt. Too many inconsistencies, too many deliberate erasures. The Cold War context deepened the suspicion. Norway had recently been shaken by news of Soviet spy rings operating within its borders. NATO installations were considered high-value targets, and the movement of experimental weaponry in the North Sea had attracted foreign interest. It wasn't hard to imagine a lone courier being caught, silenced and disposed of in a way that would leave investigators chasing their own tails. And yet another shadow haunted the case. Perhaps she wasn't Soviet at all. Perhaps she worked for the West, monitoring Soviet activity from within neutral territory. If so, her death might not have been punishment, but betrayal, a silencing from the very side she served. There was also one witness who refused to stay silent. A Bergen shopkeeper recalled a tall, dark-haired man meeting her outside his store just days before she vanished. Their exchange had been tense, hurried, and laced with words the shopkeeper couldn't catch. Later, the man disappeared into the crowd, and she walked away, shoulders stiff. Investigators tried to track him. They failed. The image lingered, a mysterious woman speaking in many tongues, observed with many men moving between NATO cities, before ending in fire among the stones. A spy, perhaps, but no country ever claimed her. No agency stepped forward. No one filed a missing persons report. That silence was louder than any confession. The dossier thickened with contradictions. Theories branched out like frost on glass. Was she an operative, lost in the cold, abandoned by her handlers? Or a double agent punished for betrayal? Or perhaps a civilian swept into currents far greater than herself? The more the investigators searched, the deeper the shadows grew. And with every unanswered question, the spectre of espionage loomed larger. Because in 1970s, Norway, nothing in Isdal Valley happened without a reason. And this woman, whoever she was, had become the most dangerous question of all. The morgue in Bergen was silent that winter, its walls echoing the sterile hum of fluorescent lamps. On a metal table lay the charred remains of the woman who had once wandered Norway's hotels under a dozen names. Now, under the scalpel of forensic pathologists, she was stripped of disguise, her secrets laid bare, yet still refusing to yield an identity. The autopsy revealed details that unsettled investigators. The woman's lungs were thick with smoke, suggesting she had still been breathing as the fire consumed her. This fact alone contradicted the idea of a clean, calculated suicide. If she had intended to end her life with pills and accelerant, why allow herself the agony of burning alive? There was more. High concentrations of phenobarbital, a powerful sedative, were detected in her blood. Alongside it, traces of alcohol. Enough to incapacitate her, perhaps enough to ensure she couldn't resist if someone else had poured gasoline and struck a match. Yet not enough to have killed her outright. Her stomach contained no food. She had eaten nothing in her final hours, adding to the impression of a staged death, hurried and incomplete. And then came another anomaly: her teeth. The dental work was intricate, costly, and inconsistent with Norwegian practice. Gold fillings and unusual techniques suggested origins in Central or Southern Europe, where such dental artistry was common. For forensic experts, it was a rare clue, a fingerprint of class and geography hidden inside her mouth. Her hands told another story. Though partly burned, pathologists noted her nails were manicured, her skin unusually well cared for. She was not a transient wanderer. She belonged to a life of means, or at least a life where appearances mattered. Yet her fingerprints, once taken, revealed a deliberate attempt at obliteration. Acid or sandpaper had partially scarred the ridges, complicating classification. She had not only been hiding in life, she had tried to erase herself even in death. The state of her clothing fragments raised more questions. The zippers had been neatly removed before burning, as though someone wished to eliminate all serial traces. Tags and labels were missing, deliberately cut out. The destruction of identity was precise, surgical. And still, contradictions lingered. A fur hat found nearby bore traces of petrol, linking it to the fire. But the hat itself had been positioned too far from the body to have burned naturally in the same blaze. Was it placed there afterward, part of an effort to confuse the scene? Toxicologists and pathologists debated. Suicide remained plausible: the barbiturates, the accelerant, the desolation of a foreign traveller. But the inconsistencies were too numerous to ignore. Why carry so many sleeping pills only to swallow a handful? Why burn herself alive rather than slip quietly into unconsciousness? As the report was compiled, detectives circled the same unanswerable question. Had she chosen death, or had death been chosen for her? One pathologist remarked almost offhand that the bruising on her neck could have suggested restraint, though fire had obscured the evidence. Another noted the unnatural positioning of her body, as though placed deliberately on the rocky ground. Even in death, the Isdal woman was performing a role, her scene set with props and contradictions. Suicide, execution, or something else entirely, nothing aligned. The final report listed the cause of death as a combination of barbiturate poisoning and burns. The manner of death, undetermined. It was a bureaucratic compromise, a label that meant nothing yet hinted at everything. For investigators, it meant the file remained open. For the intelligence community, it meant the mystery deepened. For the public, once the case leaked into headlines, it meant fascination and fear. Because if this was murder, it was a killing designed not to terrify, but to confuse. A killing without ownership, without message, without confession. The work of professionals, or of a woman who had made deception the final act of her life. And in the sterile morgue of Bergen, as her body was sealed away, a single truth lingered. The Isdal woman had been erased with purpose. The only question was whose purpose. 2 days after the autopsy, a development shifted the case away from the burned clearing in Isdalen to a more mundane setting, the lost and found office at Bergen railway station. Police received a call. A suitcase unclaimed for days sat among the forgotten umbrellas and travel bags. The station clerk had noticed it because of the date tag deposited precisely around the time the Isdal woman had been last seen alive. Investigators hurried to the terminal. What they discovered inside the luggage would only deepen the riddle. The suitcase itself was ordinary, a medium-sized practical traveller's case. But its contents spoke of someone extraordinary. There were clothing items folded with care, but once again the labels had been cut out with scissors. Not a single manufacturer's tag, no laundry marks, nothing traceable. Whoever packed this case had been determined to erase origin and identity. Then came the toiletries, among them a bottle of cologne and a jar of cream, both purchased in high-end stores in Europe. A comb still carried strands of dark hair that matched the woman's. A pair of prescription glasses lay in a leather case, though strangely without lenses. A deliberate decoy, perhaps, or just another layer of disguise. Most striking were the items of paper. Notebooks filled with what looked at first like random jottings. Upon closer inspection, the markings resembled codes, strings of letters and numbers, as though cataloguing movements. Investigators realized the notes corresponded to dates and locations where the woman had stayed in Norway. Hotels, towns, train routes, all reduced to cryptic shorthand, and then tucked in the lining fragments of currency. Deutsche Marks, Norwegian krone, Belgian francs, all in small denominations as if intended for easy travel across borders. She had been moving like someone trained to live invisibly untethered to a single nation. One discovery unsettled the officers more than the others. Hidden in the suitcase was a plastic shopping bag from a shoe store in Stavanger. When traced, it led police to a hotel where the woman had indeed stayed. The staff remembered her. She had given a false name, of course, but the memory of a striking, well-dressed woman was harder to erase. She had asked questions in fluent German, on other occasions in French, and sometimes she slipped into English. Her multilingual fluency, her choice of transient hotels, and her coded notes whispered one thing: espionage. But the suitcase still contained its strangest object, a prescription bottle. The label had been peeled off as expected, but under ultraviolet light, faint impressions revealed the name of a Belgian physician. Contacting him confirmed that he had prescribed medication to a woman who matched her description. She had used yet another false name, but the Belgian connection placed her travels squarely within the Cold War web of Europe. Investigators debated the significance of it all. Was this a traveller caught in the paranoia of her own mind, inventing aliases, cutting labels, keeping coded diaries? Or was she an operative shuffling identities as easily as others shuffle coats? The Isdal woman's belongings told of meticulous preparation. Yet the very presence of the suitcase contradicted the scene of her death. If she had planned suicide, why leave behind such a tidy map of her movements? Why not destroy it all, as she had destroyed her fingerprints and the tags in her clothes? The Bergen station suitcase felt like a clue left behind or bait. Something intended to be found to push investigators in one direction while pulling them away from another. To the police, the case was no longer just about a woman who died in a fire. It was about a ghost who had lived without identity, who left fragments of herself scattered like breadcrumbs across Europe, daring someone to follow. The notes, the disguises, the currencies, each seemed to say she was more than a tourist. And if she had enemies, they had been close enough to erase her in the wilderness. One detective, staring at the suitcase on the evidence table, muttered a phrase that would echo in the inquiry for decades. She carried the world with her, but not a name. And so, with the suitcase in hand, investigators pivoted. The next stage of the inquiry would follow her trail across hotels, passenger lists, and train tickets. A woman who burned to death in the hills now pulled the police into a shadow world of borders and secrets. The suitcase had given them more than evidence. It had given them a chase. When the suitcase was catalogued and its secrets unfolded, investigators did what detectives always do. They traced the trail of names. But here, each name dissolved as soon as it was touched, like smoke breaking apart in the air. From Bergen to Stavanger, from Oslo to Trondheim, the Isdal Woman had checked into hotels under a carousel of false identities, names that looked plausible. Claudia Nielsen Vera Schlossner, Alexia Zana Merches, yet none of them tied back to any birth certificate, passport office, or real person. Every alias came paired with a nationality: Belgian, Luxembourgish, French. She was European everywhere and nowhere at once. The handwriting on the registration cards varied slightly, as though she had practiced altering her script. But the consistent pattern was impossible to miss. She never stayed long, never lingered, and never gave a traceable address. Just a city, just a name, and then she was gone. Witnesses at the hotels painted a portrait that both clarified and deepened the mystery. Receptionists recalled her elegant, fashionable dresses, scarves tied with continental flare lipstick, always precise. She carried herself with a kind of self-assurance, the aura of a woman accustomed to anonymity. She was polite, sometimes reserved, other times inquisitive. Waiters remembered her ordering small, careful meals, always alone. Yet there were moments when she slipped. One housekeeper described finding not one but two wigs in her room, one blonde, one dark. In Stavanger, a clerk remembered she had asked about ferry routes as if scouting passage across borders. In Bergen, she had asked a peculiar question about Norwegian military movements, though it was delivered casually as though part of small talk. And always there was the luggage. Not heavy trunks, not the kind of baggage a tourist drags along. Just one or two cases, light and interchangeable. Easy to move, easy to abandon. Investigators compiled her hotel aliases into a timeline. What emerged was chilling. She had been in Norway multiple times in 1970, entering and leaving the country through different ports. She had travelled through Belgium, Switzerland, and possibly Italy. Each alias corresponded to a different passport, though none of these passports were real. Whoever she was, she had access to high-quality documents, something far beyond what a casual traveller could arrange. The more they compared notes, the more the profile took shape. Multilingual, secretive, with a wardrobe of disguises, a trail of false names and coded notes to track her movements. In another era, the explanation might have been eccentricity, a wealthy loner wandering Europe, reinventing herself for reasons known only to her. But in 1970, with the Cold War tightening its grip across the continent, the explanation, investigators whispered, carried more weight. She looked and moved like a spy. Still, even here, inconsistencies gnawed. Witnesses remembered she sometimes appeared nervous, glancing over her shoulder in lobbies or rushing through checkout, as though someone might be on her heels. Was she running from someone, or had paranoia become her constant shadow? One particularly odd testimony came from a Bergen shopkeeper. He remembered her buying a pair of rubber boots, practical, durable, designed for rough terrain. She had smiled faintly when he asked about hiking, but there was no warmth in the expression, almost as if she were preparing for something inevitable rather than for recreation. The aliases gave the investigators a path, but not a conclusion. They had dozens of fragments of a woman who had lived under masks, but still no true name. And each alias seemed designed not just to conceal, but to misdirect, to make sure that anyone following would eventually reach a dead end. Academic debates still circle this aspect of the case. Some argue that the false identities prove professional espionage. Others counter that her cover stories were too sloppy an amateur's attempt at spycraft, rather than the polished work of an intelligence agency. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether she was a skilled operative or a frightened civilian tangled in secrets she couldn't control. But one fact remained inescapable: her aliases brought her through Norway in the weeks leading up to her death. Each false name, each hotel stay, was a breadcrumb leading into the Isdal Valley. And so the woman with many names, who in truth had none, moved through Europe like a shadow, until the valley fire consumed her and left only ash, codebooks, and questions. The investigators knew that a woman could vanish behind false names, but people remember faces. So they knocked on doors, retraced her steps, and asked anyone who might have seen her. Out of these interviews, a mosaic of encounters began to form, strange, fleeting, unsettling. At a hotel in Stavanger, a receptionist recalled the woman walking through the lobby one rainy evening. She had been dressed impeccably in a tailored coat with a silk scarf, but she wasn't smiling. Instead, she looked restless, as though waiting for someone who never arrived. When asked to describe her, the receptionist leaned back and said, she had the eyes of someone calculating everything around her. On another occasion in Bergen, a taxi driver remembered picking her up near the harbour. She carried a small suitcase and gave him a destination with a flat accent difficult to place. She looked like she wanted to disappear into the seat, he said. Midway through the ride, she had asked abruptly about military facilities along the coast. The question was dropped as quickly as it had been asked, leaving the driver unnerved. Other witnesses painted a picture of a woman who could shift like quicksilver. At times she was sociable, even engaging. In one hotel lounge, she had spent an evening with a group of traveling salesmen, smiling faintly, smoking cigarettes, and sipping a cocktail. But when they tried to follow up the next morning, she had already vanished, leaving the bed neatly made and the room stripped of any personal trace. Then there was the testimony of two young hikers who claimed to have seen her in Isdal Valley itself, just days before her death. They described a woman dressed far too elegantly for the rugged terrain. She was climbing awkwardly on the rocky slope, wearing light shoes unsuitable for hiking, and looked visibly out of place. They remembered she seemed distressed, glancing back at them nervously before disappearing around a bend in the trail. That detail haunted investigators. What was a woman like her doing there alone, unless she was meeting someone? More unusual still was the account from a shopkeeper in Stavanger, who insisted she had come in late one evening to buy a toy car. The detail stood out because it made no sense. She had no child with her, no luggage that suggested family, and yet she had purchased a tiny model paid in cash and left without explanation. The toy car was later found among her possessions. Why she needed it has never been explained. In Bergen, one witness offered a chilling perspective. A hotel guest remembered overhearing her in the hallway speaking in a language he couldn't identify. It wasn't Norwegian, nor was it clearly German or French. It had an eastern edge to it, he thought, perhaps Czech or Hungarian. She had been whispering sharply to someone behind a door, her voice rising just once before quieting again. When investigators checked, there was no record of another person checked into the adjoining room under her alias. Her movements, too, seemed erratic. On multiple occasions, she had checked into a hotel only to vanish without using the room at all. Some nights, she would pay for a stay, but never sleep there. Others, she would check in under one name, and then within days, reappear across the country, under a different alias. These disjointed fragments painted the image of someone either under surveillance or desperately trying to shake it. And then came the most disturbing encounter. A Bergen waitress recalled serving her dinner only days before her death. The woman had ordered a modest meal, eaten slowly, and drunk a glass of red wine. But throughout the evening, her eyes kept darting to the entrance, watching, waiting. At one point, a man in a dark coat had entered the restaurant. The woman visibly stiffened, left her meal unfinished, and hurried out. The man did not follow, but the atmosphere of that moment remained etched into the waitress's memory. These testimonies, scattered and fragile, deepened the mystery instead of solving it. Each account gave her texture: nervous, elegant, secretive, erratic, but none brought her closer to having a true name or past. Even today, academics debate the reliability of these witnesses. Were they remembering clearly, or did the legend of the Isdal Woman colour their recollections? Investigators and detectives are still debating whether she was genuinely stalked or whether paranoia alone drove her strange behaviour. Yet the fact remains across Norway: ordinary people had glimpsed her in those final days. A shadow passing through hotel lobbies, a stranger climbing into taxis, a woman too finely dressed for a mountain trail. She was seen. She was noticed. And then she was gone, her body left to burn in the cold valley. The body was brought into the forensic hall under a heavy silence. The cold stone of Isdalen had done its damage, but fire had done the rest. Charred skin, hair singed away, hands burned beyond recognition. Yet beneath the horror, the doctors knew the truth of her death might still linger in the fragile traces the flames had failed to erase. The forensic pathologist worked slowly, peeling back layers of mystery. First the stomach. There the remains of sleeping pills, an alarming amount. Phenobarbital residue enough to suggest she had consumed as many as 50 tablets before her death. Not by accident. It was either deliberate or forced. But the strangest detail: not all pills had dissolved. Some were intact, suggesting they had been taken quickly in haste or under duress. Then the lungs. Traces of soot clung stubbornly inside the bronchi. That detail alone whispered something chilling: she was alive when the fire began. Alive, breathing, as flames curled around her body. That one fact ruled out the simplest explanation of suicide. If she had wanted to die peacefully with pills, why the flames? Why the violence of fire at all? Her blood revealed more. A cocktail of sedatives coursed through her veins, strong enough to make her weak, but perhaps not to kill outright. It meant she might have been drugged, incapacitated before the fire was set. Investigators lingered on that possibility. If someone else had been there, they had meant for her to be silenced in the most permanent way possible. Another bizarre clue: her teeth. Unlike the rest of her body, her dental work survived. And it was unusual: gold fillings, a type of dentistry uncommon in Norway, but frequent in parts of Central and Eastern Europe. The fillings were done in stages, suggesting long-term careful work by multiple dentists. This pointed to a woman who had travelled widely, possibly across borders where dental styles differed. Yet no Scandinavian dentist could identify her. The burns, though devastating, were inconsistent. Some parts of her body were charred, but other areas shielded by clothing remained relatively intact. Forensic experts noted that accelerants had not been detected. The fire seemed localized, almost controlled, as if whoever started it wanted the body destroyed, but had done so hastily. Then came the personal traces. In her stomach contents, alongside the pills, were fragments of food, boiled milk and bananas consumed not long before death. A modest, almost childlike meal. It was an unsettling contrast to the violent end. Who eats something so ordinary, so harmless, before walking into a valley that would become their grave? Even stranger small bruises were discovered on her neck, faint but present. They hinted at pressure, possibly, hands possibly a struggle. Though inconclusive, they deepened suspicion that another person had been involved. The doctors stood back, reviewing the evidence. A woman drugged with barbiturates, alive as flames engulfed her, with gold dental work pointing abroad, and faint bruises that refused to be ignored. Not a simple suicide, not a clean story. Something darker. The official report read like a riddle: death by burns and barbiturate intoxication. But between the lines, investigators knew it said something more: she did not die by her own hand alone. For the police, the autopsy forced the case wide open. Suicide was the easiest narrative, but the facts refused to fit. Who forces themselves to swallow sleeping pills, wanders into a valley, then sets themselves ablaze? And if it was murder, how had the killer left no footprints, no fingerprints, no trail behind? Academics today still argue over those findings. Some claim she was a spy, silenced in the field by handlers when her cover collapsed. Others suggest she was fleeing something or someone and chose to stage her end in a way no one could misunderstand. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the pills were an act of surrender or whether she had no choice at all. What is certain is this: her body spoke even after her silence. Every detail, the soot in her lungs, the gold in her teeth, the bruises on her skin, kept the mystery alive. Instead of closing the file, the autopsy ripped it wide open. And somewhere in the frozen silence of Isdal Valley, the air still carries the memory of those last breaths, ragged, smoke-filled, and unanswered. The investigators returned to the scene, their boots sinking into the damp soil of Isdal Valley. Snow had begun to fall again, as if nature was trying to erase what had been left behind. Yet fragments of the woman's life, deliberately burned, still clung stubbornly to the earth. Her belongings had not vanished completely. They had been transformed into ash and twisted fragments of identity. Nearby, scattered in a small perimeter, were items that should have told her story. Instead, they had been systematically destroyed. A broken umbrella half melted, plastic bottles warped by fire, pieces of clothing deliberately burned away, their fabric blackened beyond recognition, shoes reduced to husks. But it wasn't the ordinary objects that unsettled investigators. It was the strange absence of anything personal. There were no letters, no wallet, no documents of any kind. Her identity, it seemed, had been carefully erased. What survived told less about who she was and more about what she or someone else wanted to hide. And then came the strangest detail: 2 passports were eventually found among her possessions, hidden in luggage recovered from train stations linked to her. Both bore different names, but the photograph was unmistakably hers. A woman who travelled under multiple identities, always cloaked in aliases. Not the behaviour of a casual tourist, more the work of someone practiced in concealment. Her suitcases told another story. When traced to lockers in Bergen, they revealed wigs, several styled differently. Alongside them were glasses with non-prescription lenses, a kind of disguise kit. Clothes bore labels from across Europe, Italy, Germany, Belgium. Even the smallest details seemed curated to confuse. Labels had been cut out of some garments, as though she or someone wanted to ensure that no origin could be traced. Among these belongings, a notepad. At first glance, it seemed ordinary, filled with odd sequences of letters and numbers. But police quickly realized this was not simple writing. It was a code. Dates, locations, abbreviations. After careful work, they deciphered that the notes corresponded to her travels across Europe. Train stations, ferry rides, hotels. A precise record, but without context, it read like coordinates in a secret map. Who kept such meticulous track of movements, and for what purpose? The burned remains near her body told another tale. Eyewitnesses had noted the acrid smell of petrol, but no accelerant was ever formally detected. It seemed the fire had been made with ordinary objects, her own clothes, her own belongings consumed in a ritual of erasure. Investigators stood there staring at the scorched circle, wondering, did she set this fire herself, trying to vanish into anonymity, even in death? Or had someone else staged it to erase fingerprints, documents, anything that might betray her origin? One discovery stood out. Among the ashes lay fragments of rubber boots and a water-resistant jacket. Practical gear for the outdoors. This was no accident-prone hiker. She had come prepared as though she knew where she was going. The placement of her body, hidden in a valley few locals ever visited, suggested intent. But whose even her jewellery raised questions. She wore no flashy adornments, but what little remained seemed carefully chosen. Investigators noted the lack of fingerprints on any item recovered. Every surface appeared wiped clean, as if she or her killer had been obsessed with leaving no trace. The belongings, though, broken and burned, spoke louder than silence. They revealed a woman who travelled under masks, left trails of coded notes, and carried disguises wherever she went. They painted the picture not of an ordinary civilian, but of someone entangled in secrecy. And yet contradictions lingered. If she had been a spy, why leave behind such an obvious ciphered notepad? If she had been running from someone, why carry multiple wigs and disguises that all pointed to a life on the move? And most troubling of all, why attempt to burn everything but not finish the job completely? Detectives argued over the puzzle late into the night. Some claimed the half-burned items were evidence of panic she had tried to erase herself but ran out of time. Others believed the fire had been staged by someone else hurriedly before fleeing into the night. The belongings refused to settle into a single narrative. Each object was a clue that dissolved into contradiction. The more the police studied them, the more the story blurred like smoke curling upward into the cold Norwegian air. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether those burned fragments were the final act of a woman who wanted to vanish, or the hurried cover-up of someone who wanted her silenced forever. What remained certain was this: her belongings, rather than solving the mystery, deepened it. Each burned suitcase, each coded note, each wig was not an answer, but a shadow. And as the snow covered the blackened circle of earth, it was clear the truth had been hidden, deliberately buried in fire and silence. While police pored over the burned remains of the woman's belongings, another thread began to unravel the accounts of those who had seen her in the days and perhaps weeks before her death. Testimony scattered like fragments of memory painted a portrait of a woman who was both conspicuous and invisible at once. Several hotel staff remembered her. She had stayed in Bergen, Trondheim, Stavanger, and other cities across Norway, always under different names. Each time she signed the ledger, she used a false identity. Yet the descriptions of her remained eerily consistent: a tall, elegant woman, dark-haired, well-dressed. She appeared to be in her mid-30s, though her age was hard to pin down. Some recalled she spoke fluent French. Others insisted she used German, occasionally English. In all cases, her accent shifted slightly, as though she was trained to blend in wherever she went. Hotel clerks noted another peculiarity: she often requested to change rooms after checking in. Sometimes she wanted a room with a balcony. Other times she asked to be placed far from other guests. It was a habit that unsettled staff, but drew little suspicion until her death made every detail sinister. One waiter in Bergen remembered her ordering a simple meal, then sitting alone for hours, scribbling in a small notepad. She wasn't writing like a tourist, he told police. It was numbers, codes, letters, always careful, deliberate. The notepad later discovered in her luggage seemed to confirm this. Other witnesses described her being shadowed. A Bergen shopkeeper swore he saw her speaking quietly, with two men in dark coats, foreigners by their look and manner. No names were exchanged, but the meeting seemed tense. In Stavanger, another local recalled her buying rubber boots and outdoor gear, the kind later found burned near her body. She had seemed hurried, anxious, as if preparing for something she could not explain. Then came the most disturbing account. In Loen, a small village, a man claimed he saw her walking along a remote mountain path, accompanied by several men. She appeared nervous, glancing over her shoulder. When police pressed him for details, he admitted he could not hear what was said. But the impression lingered: she was not traveling alone by choice. In Bergen, hotel staff also remembered something chilling. On one occasion, she checked in without luggage, an odd move for a traveler. When her bags arrived, later delivered separately, she seemed relieved but guarded. Those bags recovered after her death were the ones filled with wigs, glasses, and coded notes. Every testimony suggested the same contradiction: she was both meticulous and careless, visible yet hidden. Witnesses remembered her striking beauty, her aloof demeanor, her shifting languages. But no one ever knew her real name. And then there was the soldier. A Norwegian army conscript told investigators he had encountered the woman months before her death near a military testing site. He claimed she had asked peculiar questions about rocket launches. At the time, he dismissed it as curiosity. After her death, his memory felt darker, tied to Cold War whispers of espionage. Piece by piece, the witness accounts painted her not as an ordinary traveler, but as someone entangled in shadows, moving through Europe with purpose, watched and perhaps pursued. The police case notes described her as an international woman of mystery, a a phrase that sounded more like fiction than fact. But to those who had met her, however briefly, she was unforgettable. Still, the accounts contradicted one another. Some saw her as calm, confident in control. Others remembered her as frightened, anxious, watching the door. Was she a spy, a fugitive, or a woman caught in a game she did not choose? In the end, witnesses had not answered who she was. They had only deepened the question. Her movements, her companions, her false names, everything spoke of deliberate concealment. Yet it was impossible to say if she was hiding from someone else or from herself. The Isdal woman seemed to exist in two realities. At once, one where she was a skilled operative, the other where she was a desperate traveler running out of time. And in both versions, the conclusion was the same. Within weeks of her final sightings, she was found burned in a valley that few ever visited, as if she had stepped out of the world and into legend. As investigators spread her belongings across evidence tables, a chilling realization unfolded. This woman had lived not one life, but many. Each suitcase contained fragments of a different identity, and together they formed a web of names without roots, lives without anchors. In hotel ledgers across Norway and beyond, she had signed in under aliases like Fenella Lorch Vera Schlosseneck, Claudia Tielt, Alexia Zahn Merches, and several others. Every passport in her luggage, beautifully forged, though devoid of authenticity, carried a different name. Yet not one matched the body found in the Isdal Valley. The police had stumbled upon an enigma that seemed deliberately constructed. Each identity came with its own style. Under one name, she was a Belgian antiques dealer. Under another, she posed as a cosmetics saleswoman. Sometimes she carried herself as a cultured traveler, fluent in French. Other times she slipped into the role of a quiet German tourist. Witnesses remembered her attire, shifting two sleek dresses one day, practical outdoor gear the next. It was a masquerade performed on European soil at the height of the Cold War. The hotel registry codes were perhaps the most unnerving discovery. In one of her suitcases, police found a notepad filled with strange numbers and letters. At first glance, it looked meaningless, but investigators soon realized the symbols corresponded with her travels dates, places, and hotels. Each alias connected to a code, each code tied to a movement across Norway and continental Europe. Her life was reduced to an operator's logbook written in shorthand. Forensic experts also discovered that every single label in her clothing had been carefully cut away. There was no country of origin, no brand, no factory tag. It was as if she had tried to erase her past, down to the very fibers of her garments. Yet for all her caution, she left behind something strange, traces of fingerprints. When police sent them through international channels, no match came back. The databases, criminal, diplomatic, military, showed nothing. It was as though she had never officially existed. Investigators debated her purpose. Some were convinced she was an intelligence officer operating under multiple covers. Norway, after all, was a vital arena during the Cold War, with NATO bases, radar stations, and missile tests. Others argued she might have been a courier moving information or materials across borders. Still others whispered that she could have been involved in black market trade, gems, weapons, or secrets. But there was one detail that kept surfacing. She always seemed to move near sensitive areas. Hotels close to military testing grounds, ferries crossing key naval passages, rooms near embassies. Coincidence, or a deliberate trail of surveillance? Then came the wigs. Several were found styled differently, suggesting she altered her appearance at will. Witnesses had not exaggerated her hair color, her style. Her very presence seemed to shift from city to city. To some she appeared blonde, to others brunette. Perhaps even that memory was engineered a trick to blur her trace further. The deeper the investigators dug, the more suffocating the web became. Instead of clarity, each alias pulled them deeper into uncertainty. The false passports led to dead ends. The hotel stays revealed no true companions. The coded notepad pointed to movements, but not motives. Still, there was one faint thread. Under the alias Vera Jarl, she had stayed in Stavanger during the same week a major NATO exercise took place. She was seen watching military maneuvers alone, standing at a distance with binoculars. A detail dismissed at first, now pulsed with significance. Even then there was no proof. No letters. No official documents. No photographs of family. Nothing that rooted her to a single truth. The Isdal woman had lived as a ghost with many names. And when she died, all those names perished with her, leaving only the silence of a burned valley and the fragments of a life designed never to be solved. But perhaps the most unsettling question of all was this: if her identities were constructed, who had built them for her? The year was 1970, a time when the world itself felt split in two. Every city in Europe carried the weight of suspicion. Embassies doubled as listening posts. Airports were transit points for more than tourists. The Iron Curtain divided not only nations, but also the secrets people were allowed to carry. It was in this atmosphere that the Isdal woman's story seemed less like an isolated tragedy and more like a shadow cast by global tension. Norway was not neutral ground, it was a front line. With long coastlines facing the Soviet Union radar installations and NATO exercises scattered across the fjords, the country became a natural chessboard for espionage. Intelligence agencies from Moscow to Washington had operatives stationed in Scandinavian cities, watching movements, mapping territories, and collecting whispers. The woman's coded notes and multiple identities began to look less like eccentricities and more like tools of a profession. Investigators whispered among themselves, was she a Soviet spy dispatched to monitor NATO maneuvers? Or perhaps she belonged to the West, embedded so deeply that even her fellow agents could not confirm her existence. Some files suggested the possibility of a non-official, covert agent without diplomatic immunity, expendable if discovered. There were also reports of her presence in places connected to advanced military technology. Witnesses remembered her near the Bergen area, a city known for naval activity. Others recalled spotting her in Stavanger, where NATO was quietly conducting naval coordination. Each sighting linked her to operations that were never meant for civilian eyes. And yet if she was indeed a spy, her death made little sense. Trained operatives did not usually end up burned in a remote valley carrying wigs and coded notes carelessly packed in luggage. Her end felt brutal, rushed, almost sloppy. That raised a darker possibility: had she been silenced by her own employers? Eliminated not by rivals, but by those who no longer trusted her. Some detectives entertained another theory, that she was a double agent. The Cold War produced many such figures, individuals caught between two masters, trading loyalty for survival. If the Isdal woman was one of them, her life had always been borrowed time. The moment one side grew suspicious, her fate was sealed. Even her choice of aliases hinted at European roots scattered across borders. Belgian, German, French identities, carefully chosen to allow her to move fluidly across Western Europe without raising suspicion. But in cutting away the clothing labels and disguising her hair, she had also cut away her own anchor to the world. She existed only as a function, never as a person. For those reconstructing her final days, the puzzle became unbearable. A woman moving like smoke across hotel rooms and ferry stations, shadowing military exercises, speaking in accents that shifted from Germanic to French. And then her body destroyed by fire, the final erasure. If espionage was the truth, then the Isdal woman was not a victim of circumstance. She was a casualty of the Cold War. But whose side she belonged to, that answer burned away with her body. Investigators left meetings late at night with a sense of unease. Each report ended with speculation rather than fact. A phrase repeated itself in their files, possibly connected to intelligence operations. A phrase designed to hint but never confirm. A phrase that still echoes in archives half a century later. The valley where she was found felt colder now. It was no longer just a crime scene. It was the graveyard of secrets too large to be spoken. Decades passed. The Isdal woman slipped from newspapers into folklore. Her name whispered more like a ghost story than a crime file. Yet science has a way of dragging the past back into the present. Where witnesses forget and records blur, DNA remains stubborn, untouched by time. By the early 2000s, Norwegian investigators began pulling her files back into the light. They still had samples, teeth-jaw fragments, traces of muscle tissue sealed away in clinical jars. Forensic science had advanced far beyond the tools available in 1970. Techniques, once unimaginable mitochondrial DNA mapping isotope analysis, were suddenly within reach. The first breakthrough came with her teeth. Scientists subjected them to isotope testing, reading the chemical signatures like a travel diary etched in enamel. The results were haunting. The oxygen and strontium isotopes suggested she had grown up in Central Europe, most likely, in an area near the French-German border. Childhood meals, the water she drank, the soil her food had grown from, all had left microscopic traces. This narrowed the mystery. She was not Norwegian at all, but a traveller from the continent. Her dental work added another piece. Fillings and techniques pointed toward dentistry practiced in Germany during the post-war years, possibly in East Germany. Tiny differences in resin and metal compounds betrayed regional practices. Each tooth became a breadcrumb, leading back to a homeland she had carefully erased. In 2016, a full mitochondrial DNA profile was completed. It suggested maternal lineage connected to Eastern Europe, possibly Poland or the Czech borderlands. Journalists working alongside private labs speculated that she may have been from a German-speaking family, displaced by World War II, one of the countless who drifted west in the reshuffling of borders. And yet the DNA raised as many questions as it answered. Investigators and historians debated fiercely. Was she the child of refugees, shaped by displacement and secrecy from an early age? Or was she recruited later in life, chosen precisely because she could cross cultural and linguistic lines without drawing attention? Her mitochondrial haplogroup was too broad to pin down a specific village, but it drew a blurry circle around the region of her birth. A circle large enough to hide an entire generation's trauma. Some journalists grew bold. They contacted genealogical databases comparing her DNA to living relatives. But international privacy laws blocked most results. And even when small matches appeared, they pointed to branches of families scattered across Europe too diluted to confirm identity. She was still faceless, suspended between science and silence. There was, however, one chilling detail. An anthropologist studying her jaw noted an unusual pattern of wear, consistent with someone who had chewed on one side more than the other, possibly due to injury or habit. Small, intimate details like that gave her life a human dimension, reminding the world that this was not just a code in a file, but a person who once laughed, perhaps even smiled. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the DNA evidence truly points to espionage, or whether it reveals something simpler, a woman fleeing her past, disguising her roots, unwilling to be found by anyone who remembered her real name. Science had brought her closer, but not close enough. Her DNA whispered fragments of a biography, yet stopped short of a conclusion. The Isdal Woman remained untethered, half ghost, half spy, standing at the edge of history's light. In the archives, her samples are preserved, waiting for the day when forensic databases grow large enough to recognize her family. Until then, she remains unidentified, her genetic code suspended like a riddle. The Isdal Woman's story began on a cold slope in Bergen in 1970, with a body that resisted identity and a life that had already been erased. Decades later, it closes not with a name, but with a constellation of fragments, teeth isotopes, coded notebooks, and whispered sightings of a woman who never wanted to be remembered. The investigators who stood over her charred remains in Ice Valley are long gone. Their notes preserved in faded ink read like half-told ghost stories: dark hair, brown eyes, average height. A woman reduced to measurements to the width of a shoe, the cut of a jacket. Yet around those sterile details swirls the mythology, the idea that she was a spy, an assassin, a courier of secrets during the tense twilight of the Cold War. Over the years, each new attempt to unmask her has added layers, rather than peeling them away. The coded notes hinted at espionage, but could just as easily have been the itinerary of a lonely traveler. The multiple identities suggested intelligence work, but they might have been the desperate inventions of a woman who simply didn't want to be found. The strange traces of sleeping pills in her stomach implied suicide, yet the way her body was arranged suggested staging. Science gave her a voice through her bones, telling us where she likely drank water as a child, where dentists shaped her teeth. But even DNA, that most stubborn witness has refused to speak her name. It circles Europe, pointing to places that suffered displacement, division, and silence. In that, perhaps the Isdal Woman becomes a symbol not only of her own mystery, but of the millions uprooted in the aftermath of war souls, who drifted across borders, some never to be known again. And so her case sits in that thin space between fact and folklore. To the police, it remains an unsolved file, a question waiting for an answer in some future database. To storytellers, it is a parable of identity, how fragile it is, how easily it can be erased, and how unsettling it is when erasure becomes complete. Her face, reconstructed by forensic artists, looks out with neutral calm. A woman in her 30s, maybe 40s. Not menacing, not fragile, just ordinary. It is that ordinariness contrasted with the extraordinary secrecy of her life and death that makes the case echo. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the Isdal Woman was murdered, whether she took her own life, or whether she was part of something larger that left no room for truth. The arguments never resolve. They fade into silence like voices in a room after the lights are turned off. And perhaps that is where the story belongs. In silence. Because maybe the answer isn't in the coded notes or in the DNA or in the isotope maps of her teeth. Maybe the answer is simpler and darker, that the Isdal Woman wanted to vanish, and she succeeded. Tonight, her file closes once again. It waits in the archives, in boxes and microfilm, until someone with new eyes or new science returns to it. Until then, her story remains what it has always been: a riddle without a solution, an echo without a source, a woman without a name. Now turn off the lights, lie back on your cushions, and let the mystery dissolve into sleep. She will stay here, waiting just beyond the reach of the firelight.